just by way of a very brief introduction, this is a slightly unusual seminar, I guess, in some respects, in that all the speakers are talking about the same data set, which is a Police in the Pandemic study, a panel study that we ran in conjunction with London School of Economics from April to August this year. It's fairly obvious what the topic of that is, I think, and you'll hear much more about it in a minute. But I think this is really the child, in a sense, of the early phases of the first lockdown, when we all naively thought that we'd have loads of time to do extra research before we realized that what lockdown actually meant was doing much more work than we were used to. But in the end, and Chris will be talking about this in a minute, so I'm not going to say too much, but in the end, we were able to get 6 waves out of this longitudinal study, covering all the things that you think you might want to cover, I think, in the context of policing during a pandemic, and particularly during the lockdown and what followed afterwards. And I guess one of the things we were concerned about when we were setting up this seminar 4 or 6 weeks ago, whenever it was, that what we might have to say might seem slightly out of date because it does primarily relate to April, May and June. But of course, given the events of the last couple of weeks, I think we're bang up to date, and a lot of what everyone's going to be saying today is absolutely relevant to the situation we're in now and then the situation we're going to be in for what seems like an eternity to come. So without any further ado, I'm going to hand over to the first speaker, who is Krisztián Pósch from UCL, from the JDI, but previously at LSE, and was at LSE when we started this study. And he's going to be introducing the longitudinal study on which all these presentations are based. So over to you, Chris.
Thank you, Ben, for the introduction. Let me share my screen. Okay. So thank you everybody for being here. I will be the person who will introduce the whole longitudinal study, all the 6 waves and the principles that we use to create this study. I also would like to mention that this couldn't have happened without the generous funding of UCL and LSE, so I would like to thank them for funding this research. So in this presentation, I will discuss policing the pandemic in the UK, what are the principles that the police used. Then I will discuss our study design, some headline findings, and obviously the other presentations will go into more detail about each of those. And finally, I provide a short summary based on the descriptive statistics I've showed you. So in the UK, very early on, the National Police Chiefs Council and the College of Policing released the 4 E's approach to how to enforce the lockdown. So these 4 E's are engage, explain, encourage, and enforce. So first, police officers should engage with the public, establish the understanding of the new lockdown regulations, of new and changing lockdown regulations, then explain why these regulations are there, what their purpose is, then encourage the public to follow these behaviors, and if they don't comply, then as the last resort, they can enforce fixed penalty notices. And even use force if the public wouldn't want to engage with these kind of behaviors. So the whole concept of this and the enforcement strategy was rooted in procedural justice theory, that basically police officers should explain what they are doing, should be fair to the public, and give them voice, so discuss with them why they are doing, and only enforce certain regulations as the last resort. And in the UK, unlike in other countries such as France, Spain, or Italy, there hasn't been a big civil unrest in any of the big cities. There have been some smaller protests, but no big unrest like in other countries. So far, it seems that the police have been able to live up to these principles and enforce the pandemic regulations well. However, early data indicates that there was some disproportionality in enforcement, especially enforcing these regulations on minorities. But obviously more data and more analysis is needed. So where does our study come into this? So I would like to discuss the study design. We wanted to field a longitudinal study following the same people and their views about the police and the lockdown regulations across the different months of the pandemic. So we started our study in the end of April, so less than 1 month after the initial lockdown was announced. And we crowdsourced our sample from prolific academic. First, we started with 1,200 people. Then we added a boost sample. Later on, I will explain why we did that. We focused on 9 metropolitan areas, so cities and their suburbs, which were Birmingham, Cardiff, Edinburgh, Glasgow, Leeds, Liverpool, Manchester, Newcastle, and Sheffield. From each of these cities and their suburbs, we collected 100 people, and we also filled our survey in London, and we gathered 300 people from there. And again, this lasted for 6 waves, and every 3 waves, every 3 weeks, we asked the participants to fill out a survey, and they could participate until early August. But some notes about the sampling and what we did to weigh the sample. So we followed quota sampling principles, which means that we could calculate quota weights. So the results I'm presenting are largely representative of gender and age. As you can see, we had more female respondents and relatively younger respondents compared to the populations of these areas. However, using weights, we could compensate for that, and also we calculated attrition weights to compensate for the differential retention, because obviously certain people were more likely to leave the study than other people. So we decided to introduce a boost sample at wave 3, because after the first 2 waves, we realized that certain participants, especially young male participants and elderly participants, were more likely to leave the study. So we sampled 300 more people from these areas who were disproportionately older, and they were more likely to be young and male, so we could keep up the number of people we had in the sample. You can see that we started with 1,200 people, and we ended the study with 1,094. The retention rates were pretty high, so for the main sample, let's call it that, we managed to retain almost 3/4 of the participants by the last wave, and this is true for the boost sample. The retention rate for the boost sample was worse, because obviously we collected participants who were more likely to leave the study, so we compensated for the people who were more likely to leave the study, and that's why the retention rate was higher there. But by and large, these retention rates are amazing, really high. We didn't expect them to be this high. So the wave-on-wave retention was almost 90%. Which indicates that both that people were invested in the study, and also that probably they had more time on their hands due to the lockdown, and that's why we think that we managed to attract so many people across the different waves. Looking at other sample characteristics, so 85% of the sample was white, and roughly 15% were either from mixed or some kind of ethnic minority background. This is slightly higher white, so the proportion of sample is slightly whiter than it should be, given the areas we are looking at. 80% of the sample were key workers, 12% lost their jobs or couldn't continue doing the paid work due to the pandemic. 8.5% mentioned that other members in their households lost their jobs due to the pandemic, and 4.2% struggled to put sufficient food on the table. So there were some people who were pretty destitute. Less than 0.5% were diagnosed with COVID during this period, and 2.6% lost someone to the virus. So these are the sample characteristics. The survey itself were made up of core modules and rotating modules. The core modules focused on 2 main topics. First one was policing. We looked at personal experiences with the police, such as whether people encountered police officers, and we also looked at victimization, wave on wave. We looked at attitudes toward the police, such as procedural justice, police legitimacy, willingness to cooperate with the police. And we also looked at attitudes toward the law, so legal legitimacy, and especially on pandemic legislation. So when a new regulation came out, then we tried to gauge public views about that. We also included questions about the pandemic and COVID itself. So we asked them whether they contracted the virus, how concerned they were, expectations, how long this will last. And from wave 2, we added new questions about fear of the virus and certain precautions that people were taking to avoid contracting the virus. We also asked questions about whether a person was affected by the pandemic. These are the ones that I've discussed already. And from wave 2, we added new questions about whether people can maintain social distancing in various situations in their work, when they are going out shopping, and so on. So this is a brief timeline of our survey. As mentioned earlier, we started less than a month into lockdown, and basically the study lasted until early August. So we went from the peak of the first wave to the relative grace period in the middle of the summer. Just to give you a quick rundown of the events, just to remind you what happened during this period. So on the 23rd of March, lockdown was announced. We had the Queen's address, and also the Prime Minister Boris Johnson was hospitalized between the 6th and 12th of April. Our study started a few days after he returned from the hospital. After the first wave, just the UK, it was announced that the UK passed the first peak of the virus. It was also announced that the UK had the largest death toll in Europe, and the easing of the lockdown in England was announced one day before the second wave of the study, and the new legislation took effect on Wednesday, so a couple of days later compared to when we started collecting the second wave data. Between wave 2 and wave 3, the Dominic Cummings scandal broke. A further easing of the lockdown was announced, and the death of George Floyd happened on the 25th of May. Between wave 3 and wave 4, we had the largest Black Lives Matter protest in London. A day later, the Colston statue was toppled in Bristol. The UK government introduced a new quarantine for people arriving from overseas, and another easing of the lockdown was introduced in England. Between wave 4 and 5, we had the first local lockdown imposed on Leicester. There were certain travel corridors established to travel abroad, and 2 further easing of the lockdown. And between wave 5 and 6, there was the biggest easing of the lockdown when the PM encouraged people to go back to work, and he promised significant return to normality by Christmas. And also face coverings were made mandatory, and the first big local lockdown in Greater Manchester was imposed. On the bottom of the slide, you can see that we started, when we started on wave 1, on that week, we had the second worst death rate from the virus, and gradually it got better and better over time. So basically, this was a period when the virus load in the UK decreased over time. So what are the rotating modules that were introduced? And these rotating modules partly reflect on what transpired during the pandemic. First, we introduced proper rotating modules. So every second wave, we asked people about their emotions and well-being, how they coped with the pandemic. We also added questions which were specific to changes in the pandemic legislation. So in the first 3 waves, we looked at compliance with the lockdown legislation. Then we added from wave 3, the compliance with track, trace, and isolate, and wave 6, because Greater Manchester, which was part of our sample, got into a local lockdown. We added questions about local lockdowns and public attitudes towards those. Other questions were prompted due to certain events that transpired, such as the Cummings scandal for wave 3, and we also added questions about the support for the Black Lives Matter movement for the last 3 waves of the study. So as you can see, there were some modules that were planned ahead of time and others that were reactive to things that were happening around us. Okay, so I would like to go into some results, some headline findings from these. So starting with contact with the police and victimization, we started 1 month into the lockdown. So the first questions were about whether they experienced anything since the start of the lockdown. And you can see that victimization was at rock bottom, and direct and vicarious contact was slightly higher compared to the other waves, simply because we looked at 1 month instead of 3 weeks. Then every 3 weeks, we asked the same questions. There wasn't a clear pattern, but there was a slight increase in victimization, then a drop. And again with contact, it fluctuated over time. Despite these changes about contact with the police, what we experienced when we looked at attitudes towards the police is very, very strong, stagnant, so basically no change over time. What you can see here is police legitimacy, procedural justice, and cooperation with the police. This is a 1 to 5 scale. And as you can see, these attitudes by and large remain the same. Again, I used proper weighting, so both attrition weights and quota weights. So these are the people who were in our study throughout. And looking at this, despite the changes in regulation and also the Black Lives Matter movement, attitudes towards the police were largely unchanged. We also looked at rules clarity, so whether people understand what they are allowed to do when they leave their house, come into contact with other people, and how to use social distancing. And also we gauged the attitudes, whether they think that social distancing as a legal requirement, so basically coming up with regulations to enforce social distancing, was a good idea. And what you can see is that the clarity of the rules deteriorated over time. So as newer and newer regulations were introduced, this kind of clarity, perceived clarity, decreased over time. However, the support for the social distancing legislation remained really strong. We were also interested in public confidence in handling of the pandemic, and we looked at confidence in the Prime Minister, confidence in the UK government, and the NHS. And what you can see is that confidence in the NHS remained really, really high across the different waves. However, confidence in the Prime Minister and the government dropped. Interestingly, you can see that at the first wave, it was the highest mark, and by the second wave, it dropped a little bit. So basically, the changes between wave 2 and 3 were really minor, which indicates that the Dominic Cummings scandal didn't affect the perception of our pool of people as much as other events. But I have to remind you that these are urban people, so people living in big cities and their suburbs, so they are not natural Tory voters, which means that to begin with, they were not very sympathetic to the government. We also looked at attitudes toward COVID-19, people's knowledge about the virus, concern and expectations about it. And what you can see is that concern over time started to drop slightly, which makes sense because the virus itself weren't raging as much in August as it did in April. However, expectations for how long the pandemic would last increased over time. So when we asked this, we asked people how long they think this will last, and over time they pushed the time horizon a little further and further. Okay, so just to summarize these results very quickly. So again, the focus of this longitudinal study was the first wave of the COVID-19 pandemic in the UK. We looked at it from the peak to the summer grace period. We looked at perception of the police, which remained positive and largely unchanged despite all the events that went along and despite the changes in contact with the police and victimization over time. So this indicates that the 4-year approach seemed to have worked well. There was a quick erosion of trust in the government handling of the pandemic and the Prime Minister, and also we perceived a slow but steady decrease of clarity of the rules despite strong support for the legislations themselves. So a couple of ideas of what does this mean for now, for the new lockdown. So there are certain dangers for the police. First, there is an increased demand for enforcement, both from the public and the government. You can see this caricature, which reflects on that. There is potentially a smaller public support for the second lockdown. Snap YouGov poll indicated that 15% of the public opposes the new lockdown. And also there is fraying elite consensus, and new political parties might be started soon, which are against these lockdowns, which can also have an impact on the support for and compliance with the rules. Thank you for your kind attention.